continuing on from the last video, which examined the government's interest as compelling, today we are going to wrap up the Court of Appeals analysis of the First Amendment in the TikTok case by looking at the second criteria of strict scrutiny, which is that the act is narrowly tailored. You know, the act. The one that banned TikTok, that's going in front of the Supreme Court in just a few days. That one. Also, side note, I've had a lot of new viewers to these videos in just the last couple weeks. I think now that we're getting towards SCOTUS, which some of us called back in April, that people are getting more and more interested, which I think is fantastic. So, I have had some questions, some comments, some DMs, all those things about why I say banned TikTok. So the act, de facto, by function, end result, end of the day, yes, I totally get it. Why it's called the TikTok ban. It's a much simpler way to do it. However, I feel since the whole point of these videos is to really go in there and break down and explain all the law and all the things to people on a level that I'm really hoping is more accessible and understandable, I can't just say in good conscience that it banned TikTok because that's not really an accurate summarization, but it is an accurate end result. Thus forth, I go with ban TikTok. Side note ended. Let's get into this case. So, interestingly and very importantly, the court begins its analysis of this issue by citing to a recent case involving Twitter that says, and I quote, "It bears emphasis that, under the strict scrutiny standard, a restriction must be narrowly tailored, not perfectly tailored." End quote. In summary, the court will ultimately find that the act meets the strict standard scrutiny of narrowly tailored as the relevant provisions are limited to foreign adversary control of a substantial medium of communication and include the divestiture exemption. In structuring the act this way, the court finds that Congress, quote, addressed precisely the harms it seeks to counter and only those harms, end quote. The opinion even goes on to say that they believe that Congress is acting within a long-standing approach to counter foreign government control of communication media in the United States. In both its written and oral arguments, TikTok strenuously pointed to the national security agreement that both parties, TikTok and ByteDance and the United States, had worked on together for years prior to the act being passed. But the court also shut this down hard by stating that the agreement itself was insufficient. Reasons for this included lack of U.S. ability to look into the actions taken by China, that the government's inability to monitor the agreement itself was insufficient, and a distinct lack of data protection for Americans. Let's look at a specific provision. TikTok and ByteDance argue that the proposed national security agreement, which was, of course, ultimately abandoned, included provisions which addressed data anonymity, and that these provisions would have effectively mitigated the government's concerns. Now, the court does agree insofar as TikTok's previous proposals absolutely contain provisions regarding data anonymity. No dispute there. However, the court then goes on to say very distinctly that these proposed provisions simply were not enough. And the real kicker says that they were, quote, very vulnerable, end quote, to being circumvented. Ultimately, the court says that TikTok's arguments about national security in the proposed agreement come down to a judgment call and not a dispute of material facts. And it then declined to, in essence, override the U.S. government's assessment of the risks. In fact, the court says it would be wholly inappropriate to, in essence, base such an override of 2 years worth of work, dozens of meetings, and scores of drafts on essentially one written brief and an afternoon in a courthouse. Side note, checks, balances, the roles of the judiciary. I'm just saying, there's a whole lot of potential implications about this argument that was just made by the court. For the purposes of this video, TikTok ban, we're heading to SCOTUS in a few days, we're going to see the forest of the trees and move on. But just know that that last argument, a little bit interesting that it was made by the court. All right, that's a wrap. So, summary of the Court of Appeals analysis of the First Amendment. The Department of Justice presented 2 national security justifications for the act. And then the court, siding with TikTok and ByteDance, fast-tracked us to the highest standard of analysis, strict scrutiny. Even at this higher standard, the court upheld the TikTok specific provisions of the act for both of the national security justifications that were presented. And what it all comes down to is that the court found that there is ample evidence that the act is the least restrictive means of advancing the United States' compelling national security interests. Now, no other arguments in this case hold a candle to that of the First Amendment. However, the court, in its opinion, does also address TikTok's notions and arguments of equal protection, the Bill of Attainder Clause, and the Takings Clause. We will get into those next.